podcast, and you're most welcome. Saliem Fakir joins us today to share about the African Climate Foundation, their work towards addressing the climate challenge that we are facing globally. Saliem is the Executive Director of the African Climate Foundation, a foundation that is developing, supporting, elevating, and catalyzing climate action in Africa. The foundation has joined the Philanthropy for Climate movement, and we'll get to hear and learn more about their journey in the movement. This season is brought to you by CIFSOS Africa in collaboration with Wings and the Philanthropy for Climate movement. What's that one thing you'd like listeners to know about you or about the African Climate Foundation?
The foundation is very young, and it's only 2.5 years old. We started in April 2020, so just slightly over 2.5. And it's the first of, the climate sort of focused philanthropies on the continent. There are many others that have been set up all around the world. And, we are the first Pan-African foundation, and it's really exciting that I personally have been given an opportunity to set up something like this and have the privilege of working with some amazing people all across the continent.
Wow, that's impressive. How did you start? How did you get to, choose your focus as climate in Africa?
So the original founders that have invested in ACF wanted a climate-focused philanthropic organization. It was up to myself and the team now to work out the details of what that would entail. And so we talked to, literally, I think over 1,000 people across the continent, and recognized that you cannot just talk of climate without also talking about development. And we have developed a framework on the climate debate on the continent that is very developmental oriented. We are interested in climate as an issue that is both negative and positive. So negative in the sense that it has an impact on our constituencies on the continent, particularly people that are most vulnerable, and also our natural environment and our economies. So we have to find out how these risks manifest and actually find solutions to them. And the second is that, we have to recognize that the world is decarbonizing. And I think the challenge for Africa is that even though our emissions are low compared to other continents and other countries in the world, there's an opportunity for us to think of our modernization that is more decarbonized in nature over time. So there are opportunities to make investments in this early phase of Africa's growth and development, and where there's a lot of new energy sources that have to be developed, particularly electricity. In sub-Saharan Africa, that's still a huge task ahead of us. We develop a strategy to try to address those issues, but also the importance of land use and agriculture for the continent. And lastly, we are a rapidly urbanizing continent, and so there's a need for all kinds of infrastructure, transport, electricity, etc. And those are the challenges we would like to, invest in solving. Yeah.
When you talk about philanthropy and climate, we're curious to learn how the philanthropy landscape looks like in your context in response to the climate crisis.
Yeah, so climate-focused philanthropy is still very small on the continent. In fact, it's quite low. It's 2 to 3% of all the funds that go into climate-related issues globally. We have been set up to try to address that and to grow the pool of funding to the continent to ensure that it's, given the size of the continent and the needs of the continent, that pool of funding becomes significant over time. It's very hard to tell what that percentage would look like in 5 years, but we're already seeing a positive trend. Even though we are contributing to that growth, there are a lot of people that are also on the back of the confidence that we are creating that the continent is a great place to invest and to drive innovation in the climate space. Other philanthropies are also starting to contribute, think about it, or at least begin to start the process of actually making those investments.
Being a Pan-African climate foundation, are there any differences you see in the way that Africa approaches this crisis as opposed to the way that the global north is approaching it? Are there any differences?
A couple of things. The one is that we need to own what you call a crisis. I see these as risks that can be turned into positive things if we find ways to integrate them into our development planning and our long-term thinking. So yes, climate issues are a global crisis. Africa is probably going to be the most affected. But our voice, our approach, our own organic evolution of what those solutions are and how we understand and deal with these risks is something that we need to, even as a foundation, we would like those perspectives from Africa to be uniquely African and nuanced by an African context and environment. So we feel that strengthening that is a very important way to not necessarily displace, but to have more authenticity and legitimacy. Rather than it coming from our people from outside of the continent. I think there was a survey done by Afrobarometer that said that most people who talk about climate issues in Africa are not from Africa. So we have to ask, why is that the case? How can we change it? And if we do change it, what is the importance of it? And these are the issues that we are grappling with our partners and our constituency.
So the people that we've hosted on this podcast so far, specifically for this season, signed the International Philanthropy Commitment on Climate Change.
Yes.
And joined the Philanthropy for Climate movement, initiated by the Worldwide Initiative for Grantmaker Support. Could you take us through what prompted you to maybe take that decision and just generally taking us through how that journey has been like since you made that commitment?
It was discussed internally. I wasn't too intimately involved in the process, but symbolically, I think it's very important for us to rally, other philanthropies behind the climate cause. A lot more needs to be done. And, I think the launch and the signing up was a very positive experience. And I just think it's really great to be part of it. And we would like more and more people to join that.
You mentioned that you, as the African Climate Foundation, you are taking steps to grow the pool of funding for climate in the African context. While at it, do you feel like African philanthropists are responsive to this, or would it be, really just taking us through that?
I think there's sensitivity to it. We are working with philanthropies in South Africa at the moment. There was a philanthropies conference for African philanthropies about 2 months ago. I do think that the interest is growing, but we have to, of course, translate that into funding from African philanthropies to pool funds on the continent. And I do think that I have no doubt that the interest will grow. So, and there will be momentum certainly in the next 5 years. It might go slow a little bit because they have to get mandates from their boards and their funders. But I'm convinced that this will change very rapidly in the next 5 years. Whether it will be large pools of funds is still to be seen.
So one of the things that SafeSource calls to mind when defining philanthropy is the diversity of what the word philanthropy would entail, in the sense that, yes, it's predominantly money and, financial support, but sometimes it's expressed differently. It's expressed through, say, people giving of their time, their expertise, their talent in a certain field, mentoring or coaching in a particular space. So do you feel that, or have you seen any other forms of giving while advancing, climate justice or in the climate space? Are there any other forms of giving besides the major form, the dominant channel of money?
I think the first paradigm is not to put money as the main objective. It's more about what is the solution we're looking for. And often the solution has a combination of processes to support ideas generation, building networks, coalitions, providing mechanisms to work out what the solutions are. And then money is obviously an element of that. And I do think that those are, there are lots of other things that go into, the dealing with the climate challenge. And our sort of approach is really to develop an ecosystem of different players. We invest in them, but inevitably what we find is that once you get an ecosystem going, the collaboration and the cooperation itself generates other goodwill and other contributions that cannot be monetized.
In addressing the climate challenge, what would success look like from the African Climate Foundation?
We hope that in the next 5 years that we are able to assist governments, communities, and business on the continent to deal with climate risk in a very positive and constructive way. And secondly, we would like to see more investments in clean energy and urban transitions. And lastly, I think we definitely want to at least triple the amount of philanthropy funding on the continent, but ensure that a substantive portion of that also comes from within the continent and not just from outside.
Is there any major experience, or I don't know if I should call it a success story, that you'd like to share with our listeners that you've seen in your work in addressing the climate challenge?
Our most successful story is that we've used very little philanthropy money to help the South African government and other potential beneficiaries raise $8.5 billion of global funding to support South Africa's energy transition and phase out of coal.
Wow.
We hope to have successes also in changing the nature of the food system, and also innovate in areas around agricultural practices, etc. So those are things that we are looking forward to in the next 5 years.
Wow. So some of our listeners are sometimes grassroots organizations, individuals playing their part in their community to address some of the challenges that the communities face, which climate change is one of them. Is there any word or piece of advice or just a message for them that you'd like to share?
I think it's very important for people who are experiencing climate change to document these experiences. So one, what does the experience look like? What is it? What effect is it having? What are the kind of solutions have they found within themselves? And, how do we, and what ideas do they have of how philanthropies can support their work on the ground? And we are of the view that we are not the only people with ideas. There are lots of people who are directly affected by these issues. They are certainly not sitting there and not thinking about how to deal with it. So clearly, in thinking about how to deal with it, they're also coming up with solutions. And we would like these solutions to surface and bubble up so that more of that can be taken up, and hopefully we can get more philanthropies to invest in the solution.
Wow. Thank you, Saliem. And thank you for making the time, for sharing your journey with us, your experiences, and just lessons on this journey. Thank you so much.
Sure.
We appreciate the time that you've taken to share this.
Thank you very much.